Hello and welcome back to What Just Happened. My name's Samuel McVicar, and today we are talking about Ethiopia and the recent parliamentary elections and how they might impact the ongoing civil conflict there. So to walk us through that, I'm joined by Benedict Manzin, lead Middle East and Africa analyst. Ben, thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure speaking to you again, sir.
So, Ben, let's start with the election itself. Polls opened a couple days ago. Your desk was forecasting an overwhelming victory for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his party. We're recording this the morning of the 3rd of June, sort of 2 days after voting began. Where are we at now with the election results? Has an official victor been called?
No, not yet. At the time of recording, they're still going through the counting process. I mean, it's a little bit complicated. So obviously, Ethiopia is a very large country. It's over 100 million people. The electoral authorities are at least reporting that there was a large turnout. Three quarters of registered voters is what they're claiming. And obviously, it's a relatively complex process because there are both federal parliamentary elections and then there are regional parliamentary elections. And added into that, we're already seeing allegations of some degree of fraud, and so the National Electoral Commission is trying to kind of deal with these allegations amidst the counting. But technically, they have to present results by 10 days after the election. So the 11th of June, we should definitely have results. But it's entirely possible that they will have announced provisional results, by the time you are listening to this recording. So it could happen at any point. Regardless, there really isn't much doubt at all that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's party, the Prosperity Party, will win. An overwhelming majority in the federal parliament and likely in almost all regional parliaments as well. The machinery of the state is dominated by this party. We're already seeing the allegations of fraud, and those, there is only going to be fraud going in one direction. No one else has the influence to really push it the other direction. And indeed, the ground has sort of been there is a proliferation essentially of opposition parties. So the opposition vote is going to be split, and major popular challengers to the government have essentially not been allowed to participate. So it's sort of a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, understood. So the other big news with this election was that voting was delayed or just completely suspended in some areas, notably Tigray, which we'll get into in a second. Just walk us through those suspensions, the significance of them, who was banned, where were they banned, why, how has it impacted the election?
So some of these bans and suspensions are pretty straightforward. It's happening in places, in parts of the Amhara and the Oromia regions, and the reasons for that are pretty clear. Essentially, there are armed militia groups in these regions, ethno-nationalist militias, the Oromo Liberation Army in Oromia, and the Fano, Amhara and ethno-nationalist militia in Amhara. And essentially, there are just some parts of the region where these armed groups are in control on the ground, or it's very, very difficult for the federal government and federal authorities to go in, and therefore they just can't hold the election in these areas because they don't control the territory. They don't have sufficient security to ensure the election in these areas. So that prevents the election in parts of these regions. That's not all of these regions. It's just kind of scattered parts of them. Tigray is a more complex issue, as I think you kind of alluded to in your question. Essentially, Tigray has been in a sort of legal limbo since the end of the Tigray conflict between 2020 and 2022, which ended with the Pretoria Peace Agreement. As part of that peace agreement, the federal government did not assume direct control of Tigray. Authority was devolved to an interim administration, which would govern the territory while outstanding issues were resolved. So this is about the future of the former party that ran Tigray, the TPLF. Outstanding questions about the boundaries of Tigray, what should become part of Amhara, what should remain part of Tigray, the disarmament of armed groups that are participating in the conflict, and yada yada yada. It's 4 years later. That hasn't happened. The federal government hasn't restored control of the Tigray region. It's still technically under the control of this interim authority. And the TPLF, the party with which the federal government went to war in the Tigray conflict, is increasingly dissatisfied with the slow pace of normalization. they're accusing the federal government of failing to grapple with their important role in the politics of Tigray and recognizing them as a legitimate political party. They're failing to restore control of Tigray to its, parts of Tigray in the west of the region in particular, to its proper ownership, failing to get displaced people back to their homes. And the federal government, on the other hand, is saying, well, you're not engaging with disarmaments, you're not engaging with our proposals to resolve the land issue, and a lot of this is your fault. So, basically, there's a lot of blame being thrown around, and the TPLF are starting to take action. They have, in violation of the Pretoria Agreement, I mean, they claim that the federal government is already in violation of it, and so this is just a reaction, but be that as it may, they have stated that they are restoring the Tigray Regional Council, which is the governing body which predated the conflict and this interim authority. And they're claiming that they are now running the region. Now, who's actually running the region is, again, up in the air because the interim authority is still there. They still occupy government offices. The government isn't releasing federal funds to the Tigray Regional Council. So what exactly their authority is highly uncertain. But clearly it's a very, very tense moment in Tigray right now. And really, it would be impossible for the government to enforce an election in this area, an election which would not include the TPLF because they have not been re-registered as a political party, without a military confrontation with the TPLF. So it seems that they've actually pulled back from that because they are not yet ready for that kind of military confrontation. So that's why there hasn't been an election in Tigray.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty rational. It sounds like a very complex issue, but it's understandable why they would just shut out voting completely. Just quickly, do you know roughly how many people would be barred from voting, including Amhara, Oromia, and Tigray? Do we have like a rough estimate?
Not really, no. I mean, it's hard to say. Again, it's not entirely clear what parts of Amhara or Oromia were able to participate in the election. And these are two very, very large regions of Ethiopia, which are very, very populous. So it's not clear. And again, it likely have been largely rural areas that weren't able to participate in the vote. So exactly how many people are living in those areas is not clear. The Tigray region is about 10 million people. But it's been a while since there was a proper census, for understandable reasons. And indeed, not everyone in Tigray would be a registered voter, and all sorts of these sort of things. So no, we don't really know, but we're talking several million people that are likely have been disenfranchised by these decisions. How significant that is in a sort of democratic sense is sort of an open question, because how free was anyone's vote across the entirety of Ethiopia?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so your report, I believe, from the 20th of May, it focused quite a bit on what will happen in the weeks following the election. Can you just explain maybe a little bit for the listeners why you think this post-election period could be just as important as the vote itself?
I mean, this really comes down to what I was alluding to about Tigray, the sense of confrontation between what is the authority of the federal government and what is the authority of the TPLF, and where are we with this peace process? Basically, both parties are sort of saying the peace process is broken down. But we haven't seen a return to conflict yet. And, while they're saying this process is broken down, they're still technically within it. They're still operating within its framework. Again, the interim authority is still in place. The federal government hasn't sent in the troops. So there is a massive question mark about what's going to happen. And it's sort of a game of chicken, because again, the TPLF, they have said, okay, we have restored the Tigray Regional Authority Council, but they haven't gone in and tried to kick out the interim authority from the government offices. They haven't gotten to the point of going, yeah, okay, so because we have restored the proper governance bodies, these ones are now completely defunct and should be removed. They haven't gone that far. They're just sort of challenging the government, and the government, by contrast, has sort of ignored the fact that the TPLF are saying they've done this. So neither side is really moving at the moment. The election could embolden one side to grapple this issue more seriously. So let's say the elections prompt widespread allegations of fraud, possible, and there is an uptick in violence in Oromia and Amhara because the authorities that have been elected are completely rejected by the local populations. Maybe this happens in other parts of the region as well. I mean, the Somali region, Benishangul Gumuz. I mean, these regions all have local sort of secessionists and armed groups that are, lower level than what we see in Oromia and Amhara, but indeed continue to engage in sporadic acts of violence. The election could substantially aggravate allegations of, the government's overbearing presence, and that could be a moment for the TPLF to say, okay, this is the moment to push the issue. This is the moment to seize these offices and restore control of Tigray properly and begin to genuinely challenge the federal government. By contrast, if none of that happens, if everyone sees this election and goes, it was a foregone conclusion that the Prosperity Party was going to win. Abiy Ahmed won, likely by fraud. If there is an apathetic reaction, or indeed if the government's supporters are buoyed by it, then maybe the federal government decides, you know what, we're not in such a bad place. We can spare the resources to deal with Tigray more robustly without having to worry about our authority fraying around the rest of the country. So in that sense, there is a lot riding on how Ethiopia reacts to the elections and how that plays into this strategic calculus of these two parties engaging in their game of chicken.
Yeah, so you're describing almost a bizarre sort of stalemate, and this election could trigger one side or the other to quote unquote snap and make a move. Can I push you for a prediction on either of those two scenarios? Do you think it would be the federal government, or would it be the militias in Tigray, for example?
I would say at the moment it's more likely that the militias in Tigray will think this is, actually we should push the issue. That comes to something that I think we're going to discuss in a bit, but it's also very heavily related to the fact that the federal government is putting the Tigray population in a very difficult situation. They are constraining the supply of fuel to the region. They are constraining the supply of cash and liquidity to the region. And so that is putting them in a position where they sort of have to act at some point, or things are just going to get worse and worse for them. So I do think that they feel the pressure more than the federal government does necessarily.
Yeah, now or never type of thing, for sure. Okay, so you brought up fuel, so that's perfect. You recently were interviewed by our colleague Marco for an article. Listeners, I will throw a link to that article in the description. I suggest you read it. I just want to touch on what was discussed in that article. So the impact of the global energy market and fuel shortages. That links to the disruption around Hormuz, potentially affecting the Ethiopian government's military calculations. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so essentially, I mean, if we think back, cast our minds back to the Tigray conflict between 2020 and 2022, the major deciding factor there, because the Tigrayans have a pretty developed armed forces, or at least did at the time. They had quite a lot of battle experience. They dominated large parts of the Ethiopian army proper, and especially Northern Command was dominated by the Tigrayans. And so when it came to ground forces fighting each other, they were essentially on par with the Ethiopian federal government, and indeed made, in the initial stages of the conflict, quite substantial advances. Where they fell behind was that the federal government was able to leverage a substantial aerial advantage provided by its own air force, but also by drones largely provided by the UAE. It seemed a few months back that the federal government was ramping up to confront the Tigrayans again, that these issues, that this stalemate was becoming intolerable for the federal government, and there was a lot of boisterous rhetoric, and we saw troops from Amhara and Oromia being remobilized and pushed northwards. And then that didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is likely because the conflicts between the US and Israel and Iran kicked off the Strait of Hormuz was closed down and fuel supplies to Ethiopia were substantially constrained. And without that fuel, that key advantage that they have, that aerial advantage, is essentially negated, or at least it puts it in a much more precarious position. There are major question marks about how long they could sustain their aerial campaign without a steady and reliable supply of fuel. So that makes a conflict between a much larger party, a party that can bring additional resources to bear against a smaller entity, a much more even engagement. Because now you don't have all these nice toys that you could have brought to the fights. You're now essentially engaging in relying on ground operations, where essentially you are on par with the TPLF, and you're also going into mountainous terrain where the defenders will have an advantage. So it does seem that whilst the Ethiopian government can't be assured of stable fuel supplies for a prolonged period, they won't have to eat into its stockpiles in a dangerous way. It's likely that the Ethiopian government is going to be very reluctant to really grasp this nettle.
Yeah, and that sort of connects back to your other answer, where you think it's more likely that the TPLF will be the ones to make a move. Yeah, for sure.
Arguably they won't get a better opportunity than now.
Yes.
Under current conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Okay, finally, Ben, if we're to circle back and have this conversation in 6 months, let's say, what are the key indicators, developments you'll be watching for to judge whether this situation is moving towards stability or is set to get much, much worse?
So I think as obviously kind of alluded to already, the status of the Strait of Hormuz will be, I think, an important deciding factor. If transit is still disrupted, then the Ethiopian government is likely going to be looking at this situation in a more emollient way. I mean, at least they'll be trying to sort it out, but there's a possibility that they might think, particularly if the TPLF start to get more boisterous and the federal government decides it can't really deal with this right now, there may be an effort to try and placate them. And we could see de-escalation looking like offers to reinstate the TPLF as a political party, some kind of progress on the question of Western Tigray, some kind of restoration of regular fuel supplies or release of cash to the region, perhaps a broader re-engagement between the Ethiopian government and Eritrea, which has been working to essentially at the moment to back TPLF sort of under the radar. All these things would be quite positive signals, I would say, of some kind of effort to diplomatically de-escalate and sort of stabilize the region, particularly I suppose, if we also saw quite a lot of US engagement and promises of US investment and so on and so forth, because at the moment the US has been very reluctant to do that because Ethiopia is a very difficult prospect. But if it seems that it would be really financially beneficial to deal with this without recourse to military action, then that might also help move the needle in one direction or the other. Things I'd be concerned about: the Strait of Hormuz opens in a relatively short period of time. We again start to see much more belligerent rhetoric coming out of the federal government. Statements about the role of Eritrea and Tigray and how this is intolerable, and they need to restore control of the border. And I suppose finally, we would be looking for signs that the federal government believed it had a handle on the situation in Amhara and Oromia, and therefore had the freedom to engage in some kind of military operation in Tigray. These would be things I'd be concerned about seeing.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. That's really good to know, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye on this. And if anything happens, we'll definitely get you back in here. To our listeners, I highly recommend you check out the article that Marco wrote featuring Ben. I will again pop a link in the description down below, as well as please do sign up to our podcast mailing list so you never miss a new episode. Once again, thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you. I'd also like to flag we have a scenario report which should be coming out in the next few days or the next week. So that may already run out by the time you're listening to this, or it's going to be coming out shortly.
Perfect. Yeah. Scenario report. If you have any questions about that, you can, listeners can email info@sibylline.co.uk. With that, take care, everyone.